Well, hello again. Uh, Welcome to our next study in the book of Psalms. And today we're going to look at Psalms 3. So if you have your Bible, please turn to Psalms 3. And as I always do, I will be using the New International Version. So I'm not going to read the whole psalm to you. It's a rather short psalm, about 8 verses, but we'll make reference to it as we go through. So, in the introduction, the caption to this psalm, it says a psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. Now, this refers to the events of 2 Samuel chapter 15 through chapter 19, verse 40. And that's in particular. But the larger setting of David's relationship with Absalom really begins back in chapter 13. Now, David referring to the time when he fled from Absalom, this was a serious uprising against David by his son, who had, over the years, had won over the hearts of some of the people of Israel by his charm. He was evidently a charmer. And we find that during this rebellion, the descendants of Saul, through his son Jonathan, betrayed David. Chapter 16 of 2 Samuel, verses 1, 2, and 3 refer to this. Many of the nation, many of Israel, followed Absalom. 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 15. And we find that there was a counselor whose strategic insight in that day was just simply unmatched. He sided with the rebel son Absalom against David, chapter 16, verse 23, and this man's name was Ahithophel. Now, at what point this psalm was written by David is really unclear. It seems from the wording that it quite possibly was written before Absalom's defeat. And this psalm echoes the primary theme of the protection of God for his king over Israel. And this is the basic theme from Psalms 1 through 41 that is repeated over and over again. And we'll see this as we look at various Psalms. Now, the basic point of this psalm is that in the midst of many troubles, the servant of God can find rest through his faith and confidence to pray for God's deliverance and blessing. So that's the main point of the psalm. As you read it, this is pretty much the primary thing that stands out as you read through these verses. Now, let's look at some of the particular points of the psalm. This psalm is called a lament, for David opens it with a cry, "O Lord." And so it's a very plaintive type of prayer. Now, this psalm opens with 3 instances of the term Selah. Now, if you look at those verses, David says, "O Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him." Selah. That's the first occurrence of that term. Now, the exact meaning of the term Selah is uncertain, but commentators say that it refers to, most probably, a pause or a rest or division, or to a change in music or instrument. So if we look at the 3 instances in which this word is used in this psalm, they come after a rather profound statement that really calls for a pause or a rest, or for some consideration, for some contemplation. And as I read to you a moment ago in verse 2, God will not deliver him. This is a statement made by David's enemies, in particular his son Absalom and those that were following him. And then the second occurrence is that he answers me from his holy hill, and this is found in verse 4. And then, may your blessing be on your people, verse 8, and that's followed by another Selah. So the first phrase echoes a challenge by Satan and his followers time and again in Scripture. It is a statement of conviction that God has been outsmarted, outplanned, outgunned, outmaneuvered. And by that, it's a projection of hopelessness onto a believer's heart through isolation, betrayal, and seemingly overwhelming odds, and maybe other things as well. Now, as we read and listen to the news today, it can almost feel that our present crisis that's got us in this situation right here is simply out of control. And that, we're hopeless in all this. We are victims in it all. But David sees God as his shield. And even as he is fleeing for his life, states that God bestows glory and hope. The answer to that challenge of hopelessness that was offered to David then, and that sometimes comes to our hearts and minds now, is in the next phrase. He answers me from his holy hill. God is always in the commanding position, regardless of the manipulations of the enemy or the situations of living in a cursed world system, such as what we're facing now. And David says, with that knowledge that God answers from his holy hill, in other words, God is in the supreme controlling position, David says he can lie down and sleep. He can be sustained and not fear. And in this day, in this time, during this crisis of this epidemic, we need to be careful. We need to be smart. But do not live in fear. Do not be fearful. Don't allow the decisions you make to just solely be driven by a panic state of fear. If anybody had a reason to be in a panic state, it was David in this situation. But David says, because God is in control, I can rest at night. Because God is in control, I cannot fear. Faith which generates love casts out fear of spiritual defeat. The favor of the Lord, our third phrase, is a confession of trust. How could David be so confident? I mean, he's running for his life. How could he be confident in this? He knew what God had covenanted with him, and he knew that God's plans cannot be defeated. And these are no lesser promises given to us as believers today. The Lord will sustain our spiritual health, even in the midst of times of physical sickness, disease, weakness. God will sustain that spiritual health. Now, look at verse 7 of that psalm. David says, "Arise, O Lord, deliver me, O my God, strike all my enemies on the jaw, break the teeth of the wicked." So he first calls for the Lord to go into action, He says, arise. Now, how can we tell God what to do? We can respond by saying, having a knowledge of the character of God and his word to our hearts. What David asked for is the ability to decisively defeat the foes that rise against me. Now, the sentence about smashing jaws and teeth would relate to military combat. Not that God would just personally break the jaws and teeth, but he would work through David and his followers. Now, throughout the Psalms, we encounter violent language. Now, we must remember, as I've said in the introduction to the Psalms, that we take these statements within their local context. However, we must not forget that God does intervene to protect his people and judge evil. And there are times that he himself is the warrior who acts. One of the lessons that comes out of this is for us to realize that when God has to move, he doesn't play. God moves in full knowledge and intent to honor his holiness, to honor his righteousness, and to support his people. So in reading Psalms, when you're running the statements like this, see that it's saying that God doesn't play. God, when he moves, when he acts, it's not haphazard. It is not by mistake. It is not out of some kind of knee jerk. He's very decisive in what he does. And so with that, let's move to the message for New Testament believers out of this psalm. The confidence of David then is the confidence we are to maintain in our trials today, but just in a different way. David had a physical promise as the king of God's nation, Israel. We do not have that position nor that type of guarantee, because America is not Israel. Israel is Israel and America is America. So we have to, remember that, and that's something that is useful all through reading the Psalms and reading the Old Testament. Now, the larger spiritual issue that relates to us today was voiced by the three Hebrew men in the book of Daniel, chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. Nebuchadnezzar said, if you don't bow, I'm going to throw you in a furnace. And what God is able to deliver you from me? And the three Hebrew men there said, we're not going to take time and just wonder about what we're saying to you, Nebuchadnezzar. Our God is able. But if he doesn't, and see, for us today, here's the more real physical promise. David had a particular promise as the covenanted king of the nation of Israel. What we have is that God is going to be with us and support us spiritually, even if the crafts and the efforts of the enemy seek to physically attack us. And what happens to believers, we are always in the position of being victors. Remember what Jesus told Martha in John chapter 11, verse 25. He said, he who believes in me will live even though he dies. So that's where we are now. We never know when some tragedy may strike or befall us, some issue arise in our life. But regardless of what those things might be, we are promised that even in and through, in spite and over them, we shall live. Our spiritual security was voiced by Paul, who stated it like this: if God is for us, who can be against us? Romans chapter 8, verse 31. David's confidence in his physical deliverance becomes our example of confidence in spiritual and ultimate bodily deliverance in the resurrection. Satan attacks even in the presence of God those that believe in him. Remember, the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verses 10 and 11, tells us that, he is the accuser of the brethren. So, but even in the face of that, even in the face of Satan saying to God, look at who they are, what they've done, how they failed, the writer to the book of Revelation says that we overcome by the blood and by the consistency of our life's testimony. And so here's another lesson for the New Testament believer from the Psalm. And it kind of comes out between this idea of trusting God in spite of everything. Where's the line between faith and unwise recklessness? Like I've mentioned, that in this time of epidemic, we need to be careful, we need to be wise, but we don't need to live in fear. Okay, where's the line? Where's the line with that? David had his confidence and faith in God's ability to answer, to deliver. But he was still, at the right end of this psalm, he was running for his life. Now, how do you reconcile that? How can you reconcile David leaving the city, fleeing, running for his life, and at the same time saying, okay, God's going to deliver me, God's going to protect me, God's going to keep me? How do you harmonize those two things? Faith is never brash. It's never just boastful, which makes faith become a temptation to God. Remember Jesus' words to the devil's challenge to throw himself from the pinnacle of the temple to prove God's protection. Jesus answered, "Don't tempt God." David could have stayed in the city, but it would have created much more tension. It would have created innocent deaths in the battle that was sure to come. So he saw wisdom in his actions, even with great trust in God. Faith isn't boastful. Faith doesn't tempt God. Faith realizes that we must act with wisdom. Faith approaches God with assurance from knowledge of his character and his promise to his people. For the New Testament believer, from the fact that in every circumstance of life, God walks with us and will never allow the life we have in him to be overcome. Remember, Jesus said, in the world you will suffer persecution, you'll have trouble, you'll have trial. He said, but be of good cheer. How can you be of good cheer in that? He overcame the world. Let's go in that confidence in Jesus Christ.